there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today we're going to use up some paper scraps, some gel prints, some old pattern papers, whatever you have in your stash. It's just been lingering. I think that when we're in adverse times, it forces us to be a little more resourceful and make use of what we have. And I'm a big believer in using what you have on hand. And today I'm going to show you how to make a bunch of scrap paper backgrounds and also how I've made these cute little cats. Now the cats are from a stamp by Laurel Birch, licensed through Stampendous. So if you want these stamps, I'll link them down below. I've had them for a couple of years, so hopefully they can still be easily found, but I thought these were so cute, and I ended up making like 30 cards and hundreds of backgrounds to use on future cards. So the first thing I did was I went through my folder where I keep leftover gel prints, because often you'll be doing a jelly printing session and you'll end up with a bunch of extras that you don't need for your current project, but they're too pretty to throw away, and why would you throw away? You spend so much time on them. So what I'm doing here is just picking out the ones that I think would be really good to stamp on top of. Now, any of these papers that have kind of a gloss to them, I'm going to need to use a StazOn ink pad, which is it's a solvent ink, kind of like Sharpie marker in an ink pad form. But some of the watercolor ones, or the ones that have more of a matte feeling to them, I can use my archival ink, which is what I prefer. I find StazOn ink is kind of a little finicky and doesn't give me a really solid impression. So, look at your ink pads and make sure you choose one that's going to work for the type of paper or fabric that you're stamping onto, because sometimes we use fabric when we're doing our gel printing. So there you can see my StazOn pad. I am stamping onto this paper that has a lot of acrylic paint and matte medium on it. So I just want to make sure that my ink's not going to smudge off on somebody's hands if they're handling the card, or isn't going to get all over my die cutting plates when I go to die cut out these animals. Now this is a stamp set that I actually did get the matching dies for, and the reason for that is because there's no stamp for the body, and there's dies for the body and the tail where there isn't a stamp for it. So I thought that would be really fun and also really neat if I cut it out of fabric or felt or something like that. So I thought that was a situation where having the dies was useful, and also I knew that I'd want to stamp these cats on either pattern paper scraps or gel prints or handmade papers or something that had a really busy background, and my scan and cut would not do well trying to cut out, like if I tried to cut this out on my scan and cut machine, which is an electronic cutter that scans in an image and then cuts it out, I knew that it would be distracted by all of the background and I wouldn't be able to use it. It wouldn't give me a clean cut. So that's a situation where I would use a physical die over a scan and cut. Now I can cut out a few at a time because, there's different faces and different bodies. I just make sure that my dies aren't overlapping each other. And I'm using my, 18-year-old Big Shot. I don't know, it's really old. I got it when my kids were just little tiny tots. So it's probably at least 15 years old anyway. But it still works great. And I think if you got one of these old machines that is still kicking, that's working great, keep it, because I don't think they make them like they used to. I've seen people that have more recent machines that have been breaking, and I've also heard their customer service has gone downhill. So I don't know what I'm going to do when this one dies. I actually do have a little backup die cutter that I got on clearance a few years ago that I haven't needed to pull out, but I really enjoy this machine. I feel like it takes fewer cranks to get the dies through. So now what I'm doing is I'm just kind of mixing and matching the different bodies. So when I'm die cutting these out, what I try to do is organize them in like little boxes. They could be anything you have, just anything to separate out the bodies from the heads, and that way it's just easier to put them together and see what you have. I also looked at some of my old school punches and basic shapes like stars and hearts and flowers that I thought might go neat with these tribal cat stamps. I thought anything that was kind of like quirky, that look kind of crazy quilty would work really well for this. And I even used some wing dies from a total other set that I had. And there you can see a bunch of the cats all put together. I think they are absolutely adorable. And I added some hearts from another punch just because I thought that it gave it a neat look. Now you could use brads to put the cats together if you want a movable element. I just wanted to kind of throw that idea out there. It really wasn't that useful for my cards that I was making, but if you were doing a mobile or magnets or something like that, it could be a fun touch to add. And these could also, with the wings, could be like pet bereavement cards too. I'm delighted with how these came out. So because I had some extra time on my hands, I thought, I really want to see what I have for scrap paper and use it up, because every couple of years the scrap paper bin, which is a milk crate basically, the kinds you can get at the Target or Walmart around back to school time that take hanging file folders, that puppy was full of scraps. And usually what I do when that's full is I'll take it down to the library, I'll do a little class on paper beads or collage or something with the kids, and then I'll let the kids take home all my leftovers, all my extra scraps, and then I start fresh. Because after a couple of years, the paper kind of gets dated. Nobody can find it. If I did use it on a card and wanted to recommend it, I can't because it's no longer available. And it's just more than I know I can use up. But since there's quarantine, there's no possibility of me doing a class like that, I figured I'm going to take this time and see what I could come up with. Plus, I noticed that it's kind of harder to find pattern papers that I personally like, which is kind of like a collage-y, wild West type of paper look, I guess. I like these kind of like funky collage-y, artsy styles. So I end up making my own paper a lot with gel printing, and I'm not really going through pattern paper that much. So using it up in this fashion, I thought was really useful. So what I did was I cut some basic cardstock colors down to 4 inches by 5 1/4, since I usually make 4 1/4 by 5 inch cards. So having a bunch of cards cut down, all the plain cardstock cut down to that size was really handy. And then for this first type of paper, I started just tearing pieces and stacking them. This type of paper is known as serendipity paper. Back in the day, that's what we called it. We would take full sheets of cardstock, just paste and glue all sorts of different papers down, maybe stamp over it, and then cut it into little squares and use those squares to embellish our cards or scrapbook pages. So I'm just taking that same oldie moldy idea and using it to make a bunch of card backgrounds. Now I like working on a piece of cardstock that's already trimmed to the card layer size that I want, because it just helps me visualize how it's going to look when it's done, versus doing a big piece of cardstock, then cutting it into quarters and realizing that each quarter really doesn't look that great. Doing it like this, I know that the scale and the size that I'm working on is going to work for a card. And I'm using a permanent glue stick. That's quite important. You want to make sure it's not going to fall apart on you. So either a permanent glue stick or a PVA glue or some sort of paste is going to not fall apart, because you don't want to mail somebody an activity if you're meaning to mail them a greeting card. Mailing them an envelope of random paper scraps, it might not go over quite as well. And there you can see you get a very shabby chic look. And then what you do is you want to flip it over and you want to trim the paper to your cardstock, so it works out really well. Now you can also use printed cardstock, or maybe if you like, I bought some they were pre-folded cards and envelopes at Michael's, and we don't have a Michael's nearby, so I tend to go a little crazy when I get to one, and I bought all these. They were on sale for $5. I hated the weight of the cards. They were so flimsy. So I ended up cutting all those down while I was at it. And I ended up using up a lot of the patterned sides on those cards, because it was basically like a lightweight pattern cardstock, and using those for the backgrounds. And I ended up saving a lot of the cardstock pieces that I cut down just to have for cards. And I've already been digging into them for card making projects, because I filmed this like a week ago and I've made a few other cards since then. So I just tried to, as you can see, most of the papers coordinate pretty well. And the reason for that is that I started off just by grabbing my red and pink file folder and used that up. And I was trying techniques with different scraps, different folders of scraps, because I would sort my scraps by color or by the most prominent color. So this pink and red one, you can see there's lots of pinks, reds, but there's also other colors that coordinate there, because I keep the pattern paper scraps too. And I just kind of go with what color I think it has the most of when I'm sorting it. I've had people ask me about that, how I sort my pattern paper scraps. So that works for me. So that is an example, that card there, of one of those Michael's cards that was real flimsy that I didn't like. So I decided I would use that pattern as the background, because I didn't really care for it. And I might as well, after I started making a bunch of these backgrounds and realizing, oh my gosh, I've got way more cardstock scraps in there than I realized, I knew I wasn't going to make 500 or whatever, however many backgrounds I could cut out of the paper I wasn't going to make that many scrap paper cards. So what I ended up doing was using the colors either I had a lot of or didn't like as much, or the patterns for my backgrounds. I hope this makes sense. So with this method, I'm using strips. So, when I'm cutting down cardstock, a lot of times I'll have these little strips left over. So I'm using the strips to kind of make like quilted designs, kind of like either crazy quilt design or a log cabin type quilt design. And since you have a lot of right angles there, you can just keep lining up and stacking strips and coming up with some really cool quilted designs, which I thought would work really good with the crazy cats there that I was making, because to me, the Laurel Birch designs remind me of crazy quilts for some reason. I just think those two designs go really well together. I think the Laurel Birch stamps do really well for paper piecing with scraps as well. Even if you don't have gel prints, they would definitely pair well for using your paper scraps. It's just a fun, whimsical look. For me, it looks really homespun. It reminds me of like crafting as a child. Calico prints were really popular in the 80s. And it just kind of gives me those warm, fuzzy feelings, which I really want this time in my life when the world feels very uncertain and crazy. So I think I don't know about you, but I definitely feel like getting more crafty with my hands, with kind of like old-fashioned techniques when I'm feeling uncertain. I feel it's very comforting. And I think that's why it's so nice to craft with your children, because it can give them that feeling of comfort and security and just self-reliance that is really nice to have during these days. So for this type of paper, so we've done torn paper, we've done strips of paper, now we're going to do paper punch outs. So it works best if you have a pattern that will tessellate, and that means the shapes will fit together without gaps. So hexagons work really well. This shape here, it's really pretty. It almost makes a quatrefoil design, but it doesn't tessellate perfectly. So my first attempts, I was leaving a little gap between the papers, and I thought that was really pretty, but you have to use, you have to put the glue on the paper, otherwise you're going to have this glue in the middle. Now, I did try one where I took a glue stick and I covered my paper with that, and then I stuck down all my pieces, and then I had all this sticky glue. So then I put glitter over it, thinking that, oh, that will just stick to the glue and be great. The glitter all flaked off. It was a mess. It was not good. It was kind of pretty, but it just did not work for this technique. I definitely would have to use a stickier glue that would stay wet longer for that. So then I thought, what if I took those, that shape, because I punched out so many of them, and I kind of overlapped them kind of like fish scales. And I liked that. That looked really cute. It did give me kind of a bit of a quatrefoil design. It used up a lot more paper punch outs. So you do want to kind of keep that in mind, but I thought it was really pretty. And you could do this with circles and it would look really nice too. So if you just have a basic, like 1 inch or 3/4 inch circle punch, I think it would look even better because it would give you that mermaid scale look that's really popular right now. So I did a bunch of those. I do think they're cute. The thing that I really like is that you don't have to be too fussy over what colors you're using. I think most of these were from my green and blue bin, but still there's bits of red, there's bits of yellow in there, there's brown. I think it's really pretty. And you want to make sure that when you're doing these techniques that you have like a piece of wax paper or a Teflon sheet or a silicone sheet to let them dry on, so they won't stick permanently to something else. And again, you trim the backgrounds just like you did before. And here are some examples with different size punch outs. I think they're really pretty and they give you that quilty homespun look. Now you can also run these through an embossing folder to give it that real quilted look that I think is really pretty, and I'll show you that in a second. So for the hexagons, it's even easier because they do fit together perfectly. You can do it with a gap, or you can do it with no gaps. It's completely up to you. And it's fun to play with these different patterns. I think it gives you that satisfaction that you would get from quilting, but it's so much faster and easier. And I think if you're a quilter, you could actually use this to try out some different designs and kind of get some inspiration before you spend a lot of money on fabric or a lot of time in quilting something. I have quilted a couple times, small projects, and while I find it a lot of fun, I also find it very tedious, and I'm not a very precise person or someone who enjoys a lot of precision. So every once in a while I'll get the urge to make something small, like a placemat or a tiny quilt, lap quilt or something, but then that urge surpasses. But this, man, I could make scrap paper backgrounds for days. I think it's so pretty. Oh, and something I want to mention, there's the embossing. Isn't that pretty? It just does look like a quilt, doesn't it? It's so pretty. Now, I will mention it's better to do the embossing right after you make the paper. If you're using glue sticks, it helps push that glue together. I find if you do it later and you used a glue stick for the background, it could make the edges pop up because the glue sticks are not as good as a wet glue. Now, I took some of the backgrounds and I did some heat embossing. I just used a roller stamp. I used also a clear stamp, like you can see here, and an unmounted stamp. You can literally use anything you have, especially if it's got kind of like an abstract design or an all-over pattern, because you're not really going to notice the all-over pattern. It's just going to look like little bits of pattern and shimmer. It's really not going to be that noticeable. So you don't need to run out and buy some gorgeous stamp. Seriously, anything you have is gonna work. When I'm using an unmounted stamp, I like to ink up the stamp and press my paper to it, because you're gonna have different levels with your paper. You can have thicker paper and thinner paper. By putting it on top and pressing it down, you'll get a better impression. And again, I'm just using gold embossing powder. I'm keeping my supplies fairly simple so it doesn't get crazy. Now with the heat, I will warn you, if you use the glue stick, it might make some of your layers pop up. So if you notice some of them lifting, you'll want to re-glue them. I think that glue sticks don't work that well when it gets really, really, really dry. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you think you're going to do a lot of embossing, then I would make sure you use like a wet glue, a PVA glue or a matte medium to do your gluing. So this is just something to keep in mind. So this stamp, the stamp set from Stampendous, the Laurel Birch one, had a really nice friendship sentiment, which I thought would just be wonderful to do happy mail during this time. And to mail some friends, especially because when you're done this, you're going to have so many cards. You're going to have dozens and dozens of cards. So I stamped a bunch of those friend sentiments out on some white cardstock and set them aside to dry. And then I'm taking one of my backgrounds and just adhering it to a folded black piece of cardstock. So it's a half a sheet of heavyweight black cardstock folded in half. So nothing fancy. Now I have a bunch of mulberry paper in my stash. This was a printed one, and I thought it'd be a nice texture to have some mulberry paper. So I set the cat down on the mulberry paper and I traced around it with a wet brush. And then I can tear the paper and it will tear along those wet lines really well. So it's a great way to use that mulberry paper. It gives you that fabric texture, that organic texture. It's so pretty. And I know a lot of people probably don't know that technique because it's, not many people use mulberry paper these days. So now I am making a little frame with some washi tape around my sentiment, and what I'm going to do is use a die to cut that out because I thought that would be really pretty. I have a lot of washi tape. It would help me use it up, and then I thought that would also just look really charming and cute. I found the sentiment to be too large for the front of these cards because they're only a A2 size card, so I'm going to end up using that on the inside. To adhere my washi tape, my mulberry paper to my card, I'm using that permanent glue stick, and you can use wet glue on the cat to push through the glue if you need to. You might not even need to. But then again, it's not a bad idea because a glue stick is only, so strong. So I'm using some of that same washi tape to stick down a scrap of peach cardstock in the middle. So my smaller cardstock scraps, I cut down to 3 inches by 4 inches and put them in another bin because I think they're great for putting these temporary inserts in the card. And the reason I do this is so that somebody could remove that card and then send it off to a friend so they could recycle the card. I like to do that because, you put some time into your cards. It's nice if they can get reused a couple times before they end up getting tossed in the trash. And then to embellish it, you could use some buttons. That might require a little extra postage if you do a lot of buttons on your card. I find it usually doesn't unless you're really covering it with buttons, but I didn't end up doing that to too many of the cards because I thought it kind of detracted, but it's up to you. Look around your house, see what you have that you can embellish with, or really the paper is, a lot of the patterns that you're making are they're so intricate that you really don't need to do that much. So I just basically grabbed a background, grabbed a cat, glued it together, and that was that. Oh, I did a rhyme. There you go. You can remember that. It's just so fun. And I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I hope it inspires you to use up some of your scraps. And here's a look at some of the cards I made again. I did make more than this, but I had to stop creating to get this video up to you. And I'm just so thrilled with how they came out. You can really get creative. You can even chop up like old paintings. Like if you're like, I cut up my old watercolors that I don't like, and I will use those as some of my scrap papers. You can turn them into bookmarks. There's so many different things that you can do with this technique. Just have fun with it. Use up the stash that you have. It'll make you feel good because you bought and paid for these supplies. It makes you feel so good when you use them up. And when you turn something that's basically scraps or on their way to the trash pile into something that's useful and loved. Thank you so much for watching. Please give me a thumbs up before you go. Take care of yourselves and each other. Until next time, happy crafting.